It's great to be here. We've had a nice week, and it's great to come to West Point and have the roundtable. I'm glad everybody came. We were talking about this as a committee. Do we do a topic on fiber and ethanol? And I said we should because we think it's something that you should be thinking about. And I should have kept my mouth shut because then they asked me to talk about it. But in all fairness, I've been in a lot of meetings the last 6 months. I know you get to go to a lot of meetings, and I get to go to a lot of meetings. And one of the things I've learned from some of those meetings are what the intentions or plans are long-term for using fiber to make ethanol. So this whole cellulosic ethanol concept. And so part of this today is to get you prepared for that. Because it's been discussed that, well, cellulosic ethanol is going to be 10 years from now, and that was about 10 years ago, but it was about 10 years away about 2 years ago, too. And it's not 10 years away now. We think it's less than 10 months away. So the thing is that with ruminants, you know, one of our advantages or opportunities here is to use fiber. So we do that in a lot of different ways. For instance, we can have grass hays, silages, corn stalks, green lush pasture, corn stalk grazing, and then even in the feedlot phase, we're using fiber. You know, we think about the U.S. system and not using a lot of fiber, but I'm going to hopefully change your mind on that, all to produce beef eventually. Okay, so why can cattle use fiber? Now, none of you probably care about this slide, but it's probably the most important slide, and that's obviously because they're ruminants. Cattle cannot digest fiber. You and I cannot digest fiber. We don't have the enzymes to digest cellulose. Cattle don't either. So how in the world can they be growing and doing well with fiber? Well, the main reason, which some of you may have seen before, is obviously the rumen reticulum. Okay, so there's this big rumen reticulum that the feed goes in first, and in that rumen, there's all these bacteria. In fact, for every cc or every milliliter, which is 1 cc, there's between 100 million and 1 billion bacteria. Those are the ones that have the enzyme to digest the fiber. And there's about 50,000 cc's, or 50,000 milliliters in that rumen. So there's a lot of bacteria. They're the reason why cattle can grow on fiber. From that point on, the feed, once it goes through the rumen, ends up in the omasum, which primarily removes water, and then it goes to this abomasum. That's really the stomach. So when people say that ruminants have 4 stomachs, that's not true. They only have 1 stomach. Stomach being defined as the organ that has the acid production just like ours. So from that point on, from the abomasum on down, from here down to the end, cattle are no different than you and I or swine or other non-ruminants. So it's this part ahead of the true stomach that's really what's unique, which allows them to digest fiber. Okay. I'm going to focus some on fiber, obviously, but to simplify nutrition first, it isn't, there's a few nutritionists here, it's really not that complicated. Nutrition simplified is energy, protein, minerals, vitamins. Don't forget about water. We take that for granted and we shouldn't. So it gets a little more complex because energy can come from starch, which is the component in grain, can come from fiber, and it can also come from fat. Now, cattle have an upper limit on how much fat they can handle, so really what we talk about is starch and fiber, particularly in feedlot diets. Protein, to be honest, we've taken protein for granted the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, we've talked about it, I don't think we teach it that well anymore. Why have we taken it for granted? Because it's inexpensive and relatively abundant. Why is it inexpensive and abundant? It's primarily because of the byproducts. But I want you to think about something. protein worldwide is not abundant, okay? So this is what's happened recently, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. One of the reasons distillers' prices and byproduct prices jumped is because there was such a demand for it worldwide. So if we have excess and it's abundant and relatively inexpensive, it will find a home wherever it's needed. And that's been one of the issues we've been faced with. So we think about it being inexpensive. I want you to think, though, that worldwide that's not the case. There are some implications to excess protein, because we're probably feeding 150% of the requirements when we feed a lot of byproducts. What do they do? Well, if you all eat steak the rest of the day, which you should do, you're not going to die from lack of energy, right? What are you going to do? You're going to digest that protein, and when you have excess protein, or when cattle have excess protein, they digest it, they get rid of the nitrogen, they urinate it out, and they use that part that's left from the protein for energy. So they can use protein for energy, and that's really what they do when you overfeed it. Vitamins A and E are the ones that are critical for cattle generally, and then, of course, the minerals. Okay. I'm not going to talk about really any of that again except for the issue of fiber. Now, as a feedlot person, which is what I consider myself, I'm going to make some comments here which I never thought I would say. If you look at it, fiber is the most important thing for us in the beef industry, and that means forages. And I'm going to justify that comment now. If you look at the statistics for cattle that are intensively fed, what I would call marketed as market-fed beef, 98.6% of them are grain-fed or grain-finished. Okay, so that means there's about 1.4% that's grass-fed. It's not a big component, and I don't see that changing dramatically. But we obviously have beef that's produced from cull cows or lean meat. And if you add that amount of meat in, I think this is statistics from last year, that means that you get to about 81% of our total beef produced in the U.S. is what I would call grain finished. Now, even with that, though, that doesn't mean that 81% of our feed needs in the beef industry are grain-fed diets. The reason why is because if you look at the statistics, again, from about 2 years ago, the published average was 153 days that cattle were in feedlots. I think that's gone up. If you look at some of the more recent numbers, it's about 160 to 165. Either way, because I had data on it, it said 153. That's the number I used. Well, how old are they when they go to market? That's not tracked well, and so you can argue with me, but if you look at it, you have cattle that may go to market at 400 days of age, right? If they go in April or May as a calf fed, they'd still be over a year of age, so let's say it's 400 days. And you got some long yearlings that may be out there at 700 days, right? You can argue with me on those two numbers, but I just took 400 and 700 and what's in the middle? 500 to 550. So I'm guessing at that. I was conservative, and I said, okay, let's use the small end of that. Let's say that all of our cattle on average get to market at 500 days of age. 153 days divided by 500 days is 30.6%. What's that mean? That means even for the U.S. system, that's the most intensive system in the world, our steer that goes to slaughter out of a feedlot is only fed a feedlot diet for 30.6% of its life. Does that make sense? Now, the U.S. system, most cows, what's the average? 0.9 calves per cow exposed? Something like that? Maybe lower than that? So we don't even have one calf per cow that gets to market, right? So you have a cow, because of her gestation time, that's around for a year for every steer that goes to market. What do we feed her? Well, feed her in the feedlot, right? Generally. Some days we do. So those cows are being fed, I'm presuming in this, a forage-based diet. You got to account for her. So if you got a cow around for a year, she eats more than a calf, etc. I estimate 82.3% of the feed that goes into our beef industry system here in the U.S., which again is the most intensive one in the world, is forage-based, or at least fiber-based. We can debate that, but it's probably higher because I didn't account for replacement. So I think it's at least that. So as a feedlot person, this is the part that pains me, forages are more important to us long term than grain. We're going to produce a lot of grain. Now, the other plus is that fibers are competitive advantage. Cattle utilizing fiber is great because we can't, no other major livestock species can compete with that. It provides the majority of their feed needs, which I've just described, and especially at the local level, you know what the implications are when we're short on forage, i.e. when there's a drought. It creates all kinds of havoc, including for feedlots, right? Even when we have a drought, we produce 12.5 billion bushels of grain under a drought. So we're going to produce corn, but we don't produce a lot of forage when we have a drought. The other thing you got to keep in mind, and I keep saying grain-fed, and yesterday they got on my case because even in feedlot diets today, it's a lot of fibrous byproducts. On Tuesday when we were in Scotts Bluff or in Bridgeport, we talked about bee pulp. Obviously we have distillers grains where we were yesterday. We have distillers grains in corn gluten feed here. So we use, and of course for those online in Iowa, they would have similar types of byproducts, fibrous byproducts is what we do here. They're usually price competitive to grain. They have some other benefits such as ration conditioning and acidosis control. So I look at this and I guess I'm going to make a comment that if anything, I think the industry's promoted the wrong thing. Because on the policy side, the industry is a little bit of a promoter of cellulosic ethanol and I would say a little opposed to grain ethanol. Does that shock anybody? Does anybody disagree with me if that's generally the industry stance? If I was a cattle person, I would have the opposite view. Because at least with grain ethanol, historically, we've had some good coming back. That'll be my last policy comment, which I'm not supposed to make any anyway. Okay, so what is this fiber thing? I want to get to this a little bit and then talk about cellulosic ethanol. So when you get a forage sample, and you've probably done this even as a feedlot, send in hay samples, maybe the byproduct samples, you can run 3 tests. The first test is what they call NDF, neutral detergent fiber. All that means, some of you won't relate to this very well, but it's like washing your clothes. You boil it in a detergent for an hour. And when you boil it in a detergent for an hour, you measure 3 things: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Hemicellulose is readily digested normally. Cellulose is fairly well digested. Lignin is the part that comes out the back of the steer, right? It's almost indigestible. So when you measure NDF, you measure all 3 of those things, and we use that to predict how much cattle can eat of a forage. When you measure ADF, which is another acid detergent fiber, it's called, you boil it in a detergent that's acidic for an hour. You measure cellulose and lignin. ADF predicts how digestible a forage is. And then, of course, you can measure lignin. So the point is that those are the 3 most common fiber tests. The one we're most interested normally in is NDF. So how do we use fiber? Just a second. Matt, are we good on... for fiber, there's different ways of using it. Obviously, we got the cows in the backgrounding sector, but even in the feedlot side, the majority of the forage that you're buying, at least 50% of it, is generally going to be used for receiving cattle and then grain adaptation, unless you're using byproducts for adaptation, which we've done a lot of work on. And then you've got the rough feeds that you're just normally going to feed, which may account for 40, 50, 60% of the forage you buy. So those are the main uses I can think of for forages or fiber. It may or may not be the cheapest source of energy, unless it's, and then the byproducts, you really got to think about the high fiber byproducts completely separate from forage, because they're just so digestible and relatively high in energy. Okay, so I'm going to make some comments. These are things that you could have read publicly or are available online. So I'm not telling you things that I'm privy to for some reason or another. But when people talk about cellulosic ethanol, there's primarily three big plants that are going to and are being built. Two of those are in Iowa, and of course they're online and probably know more about this than I do. The first one that I think is probably the furthest ahead is Poet DSM plant. It's called Project Liberty near Emmitsburg, Iowa. Those online know where that's at, but Emmitsburg, north central, northwest Iowa. Their plans are to operate this spring, which I think they're on track to do. Will produce about 20 million gallons and then gradually go up to 25 million gallons. So relative to grain ethanol plants, these are not as large. 280,000 dry ton of corn stover is what they project is needing. It's a fair number of bales for those of you who bring in corn stalks. If you want to know more information, those are available. Those slides are in your proceedings, so you can access that online. The second major plant, again, is in Iowa, DuPont, near Nevada, Iowa. Again, if you look at the state of Iowa and you put a dot right in the middle of the entire state, you're going to be pretty close to Nevada, Iowa. It's opening this summer. 30 million gallon plant, 375,000 tons of stover. That's what they have online, but they don't specify that that's dry. I don't know whether that's, I'm assuming that's maybe as is. But the thing that they've also done a good job of is describing how big of a circle they're going to pull stover in. And 190,000 acres per year, and their proposed plan is to rotate that once every 4 years. So it's a 30-mile radius from Nevada, Iowa, where they will harvest corn stover from, at a rate of about 1.5 to 2 tons per acre, I believe, from what I recall. Those of you that apply your manure, hopefully on a phosphorus basis, know what we mean by that, but similar to phosphorus, where you apply manure once every 4 years to a field, but you don't come back for 4 more years, so you need to have access to 4 times as many acres because you only apply once every 4 years. Does that make sense? So they're looking at the same concept here for stover. Again, you have the internet website for that. The last big plant that was all supported by DOE grants is Abengoa, Hugoton, Kansas. I had to look that one up. If you look at southwest Kansas, it's the second from the last town you hit if you're in southwest Kansas going into Oklahoma Panhandle. I thought it was the last one, but there is actually one more you run into. It's about as far southwest as you can get and be in Kansas. Pretty good cattle country, feedlot country in that area, right? They say 25 million gallons, 365,000 tons, and they use a mixture of ag waste, which I enjoyed reading that term. I don't know what ag waste means. Non-feed energy crops, not sure what that means either, because most feed crops are energy-based. And then wood waste. And I've been to that area, and I don't know where they're going to get the wood from, but I'm not making light of it. My point is that they're going to operate too. I don't know how far advanced they are in the construction phase, though. So I don't know if they're on target for April or not. So those are the 3 big plants that are going to be competing, frankly, with producers in those areas for fiber, generally speaking. Now, the other one that I want to mention, again, it's online. The information I'm providing you is public. Kurt Rosentrotter, who's an ag engineer at State University, is now the executive director of the Distillers Grains Technology Council, was quoted as fiber removal from distillers is the next market changer. That was in December in the magazine Ethanol Producer. My point is that as they develop cellulosic ethanol and there's fiber in distillers grains, that's on their radar. Last summer, there was an announcement about some plans that Quad County has near Adelva, Iowa, to potentially look at removing some from distillers grains with plans to open this spring. So if you remove the fiber, this again is from the Ethanol Producer Magazine. It's projected that you can lower the oil content. It will be a higher protein distillers grains. What I enjoy reading is that they say that's a better feed then. What do they mean? Because they're saying that actually taking this fiber out is going to make it a better feed. What do they mean? No one wants to talk. Anybody online? Who's it a better feed for? Pigs and chickens, not for you. At least I haven't been proven that yet. So when they say it's a better feed, they're not talking about you. They're talking about pigs and chickens. Because they want the protein. Same idea as where distillers went last fall until January, and that's China. Why is a protein source? Distillers is normally 30% protein. You make it 45, it's a better feed for the swine and poultry industries. My point is that I take a little exception, if you can't tell, that it'll be a better feed. Okay, a couple more slides and concepts, just to make sure everybody's clear. There's two pie charts here. The first one on the left is corn, and it's broken out by its components. Corn is about 2/3 starch, which is the yellow component, and about 10% fiber and about 9% protein. Distillers grains, this pie chart on the right is supposed to be 1/3 as big as the other one, because that's how much dry matter comes out when you make corn into ethanol. And notice that if you have 100 pounds of corn and it's 10% fiber, that means you got 10 pounds of fiber. You've got 10 pounds of fiber here. It's just that now it's 33% of it. Is that clear to everybody? That you concentrate everything that's not starch. That's the component that's being targeted primarily. The fat is obviously being removed, and we'll discuss that throughout today. The other thing to keep in mind is who's the biggest users. In 2005 compared to 2013, we produce about 4 times as much. So my pie chart on the right is supposed to be 4 times the size of the one on the left. Beef cattle were 53% of the market for distillers grains in 2005. It's 40% in 2013. So obviously it's grown primarily because the amount of distillers has grown, but we're losing market share. Or access, I would say. One of those ways is through export, and then of course pigs and poultry are increasing. They will be a competitor for you for distillers grains, I believe, particularly through export in the future. So what then? So what does that mean? Well, we're trying to guess. I just want to review this briefly. Distillers grains, we've done a lot of work on that, and all of you are familiar with that. If you look at feeding it at 10, 20, 30, or 40%, these are what we've seen from cattle performance as value relative to corn. So 30% inclusion, wet's about 135, modified or partially dry is about 120, and dry is about 112. That's all based on data. It's the best numbers that we can provide. So just to quickly remind you, we joke that wetter's better. You get better performance. By the way, the same concept holds true for gluten feed. Drying costs the plants money, so wetter should be cheaper. You need to price these on a dry matter, or better yet, an energy basis. But I also want to remind you of one thing, especially if you're a feedler near a plant, you save them energy. And I think that's going to be a big deal in the future. So our greenhouse gas savings, in other words, energy inputs, go down if we can produce it wet. And the only way we're going to produce it wet is if you're close to them. So the cattle industry needs to really capitalize on that advantage that we provide. That's a real opportunity in feedlot cattle. Doesn't seem to hold true for cows or forage-fed calves, and of course isn't true for pigs and poultry. Okay, if I asked you guys today how much you're paying for distillers, nobody wants to tell me. They'll tell me secretively, right? So I didn't want to provide anybody's information. So I'm just going to give you my example, because then no one can argue with me about it. So this is for our University of Nebraska research feedlot. And I want to take you through what's happened the last year, because many people say, well, Galen said we should be feeding distillers grains, and that's true, I have for the last 10 years. And the reason I told you that's because it was economical. And it usually is. I didn't say always, did I? I said usually. So what's happened? Well, corn was $7.47 in September of 2012 at the University of Nebraska, near Mead. And I was buying distillers grains at about 90% that price. July of 2013, price was $6.68. I was buying distillers at about 110% of that price. September of 2013, corn dropped to $5.20. All of you are aware of that. And my distillers price didn't. So as a proportion of corn, it was about 135% of that price. January, it eased tremendously, both in corn and in distillers. I don't know if you've seen a similar trend. Does anybody know why that happened? One reason I think that happened? Yeah, China had a disruption, I would say, at the border and put a wrench into exports. So what's going to happen in the future? I don't have a clue. But something to be prepared for. So what are those economics? I get asked that a lot, and we have a tool available for you to use to test that for your own situation with your own corn price and your own distillers price. And you can look at graphs like this where you can price distillers at 80% of 420 corn, which is what this graph is, 100% of 420 corn, 120 or 135. This is for wet. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because I've had a lot of questions. Well, distillers got to more than corn, so I'm going to quit feeding it. You can do that, but my recommendation is to evaluate it on this basis. I'm not encouraging you to pay 100% or 120% the price of corn, but if you have to pay that to get it, you have to make a good decision on whether you should feed it or not. And that's a tough decision to make unless you have data. And so, fortunately, even at 120% the price of corn, it's worthwhile to buy if you need the protein, because that's where a lot of the benefit's coming from. Modified looks different. Modified has less energy, so those curves are different. The scale stayed the same, but the lines change dramatically if you talk about wet or modified. So that's why I think you have to go through those concepts with yourself and your nutritionist. Obviously, that's what you're getting help for. So you need to monitor this price relationship with corn. They have been economical, and especially prior to 2013, I think that's clear. Even with last fall's economics, though, you probably still had to include a little for protein as an economical decision. This is going to change more in the future. That's part of what we're trying to prepare you for, and we're going to try and work on that. Here's the dilemma we have. How in the world do I test the impact on feedlot cattle until I can get material to test, right? That's a bit tough. And that's what got us in a bit of a challenge with the oil removal, because it surprised us, and we weren't ready for it. We didn't catch up. We're catching up now. So I'm a little worried about this concept that if they continue to change, how do we stay ahead of that change so you know what to expect before you have to buy it? Clearly, as a feedlot person saying this, fiber is the most important component to the beef industry, even in the U.S. with an intensive beef system. Okay, so how are we going to try and help you? One way for us to predict what's the impact is to go back and look at all the different components and see what the impact is when we feed it. So I want to take you through that very briefly, a few different concepts where we've fed distiller solubles. We've looked at the grains relative to solubles, the syrup, because they're both produced and you can put them together in different combinations. We've done a lot of work now on the value of that corn oil. And then there's some older work actually looking at what's the value of the protein. If you just calculate this, by the way, when I say protein, just so everybody's clear, I'm talking about the bypass protein. If you look at feeding bypass protein, if it's cheap, and we do some assumptions based on how it's used by the cattle, it has, and the energy content of protein, it's about 148% the energy value of feeding corn. Because that corn's digesting the rumen, the protein bypasses it. And anything that's digesting the rumen can actually lead to some inefficiency. Having microbes digest the feed first, if it's corn, is actually got some inefficiency in it. It's very efficient if it's fiber because that's the only way you're going to get it digested. You understand the problem? So this bypass protein actually has almost 150% the energy value of starch fed to cattle that's digesting the rumen. And then what's the impact of removal of fiber? Okay, so to start off with, Published in 2012 in our beef report. Alan Trankel at Iowa State had done some work with solubles up to 12% of the diet. We looked at it up to 36% of the diet, and as you increase it to 36% of the diet, feed conversion got better and gain got better in a dry rolled corn, high moisture corn based diet. Dr. Luby's looked at it out in the Panhandle, same design, but notice that this is with flakes. Feed conversion got better, gain got better, especially in this 18 to 27%. So the syrup or the solubles from ethanol plants has tremendous improvements in performance, has some real value for us to keep. Some older work from 2009 looked at different ratios of grains to solubles. If we just feed distillers grains without the solubles versus 85% grains, 15% solubles, and then 70% grains, 30% solubles, all three of these were fed at 40% of the diet. Okay, so it's feeding 40% distillers grains, but just whether they had mostly grains or normal grain solubles. Didn't have much impact in that specific study, which surprises us. Probably, this is going to pain me a lot to say because he's in the room, Rick Stock and Terry Klopfenstein did some, I think, groundbreaking work. Notice the year that was published is in 1996. And what they were trying to do, I'm joking, Rick, obviously, but what they were trying to do is evaluate just the question that we're asking today. What is the value of the fiber? What's the value of the protein? What's the value of the fat? Does that make sense? So the only way to really test that is to put those different components together and then separate them. Does that make sense? So that's really what they were trying to do here. So they had a corn-based diet, gluten feed in the diet. I believe that was Columbus. Then they had a composite, which had the fiber, the bran portion, protein, and fat. Then they took that same thing but took the fat out, and then they did that same thing but took the protein out. Does that make sense what they did? And if you look at this, conversion to 7:1, out here with the fat, fiber, and protein conversion 6:8, you take the fat away at 6:9, take the protein away at 6:7. So that was part of the goal of trying to evaluate this. We're going to revisit studies just like this now with cattle experiments. Matt's going to cover this in much greater detail, so I'm not going to, other than to tell you to listen, if you're going to stay the whole day, to his research update, because we've got a lot of data now on this oil removal. This is in your slide set as well. Okay, the last concept then is I've talked a lot about, so fiber is important in the beef industry. Where's a lot of that fiber coming from, especially from a feedlot sector, is byproducts. But there's also these other fibers. And so what else are we trying to do? I'd say that the University of Nebraska is on a mission, which is fairly a strong word, but we're going to focus heavily, and have been the last few years, on using corn residue. We've had a major focus on use of byproducts, which we're going to continue for the last 10 years. Why did we focus on byproducts? Because we thought there's a tremendous opportunity for you in our state and in surrounding states to utilize those byproducts to improve your bottom line. We're going to have a similar focus, if you will, on corn residue, because we feel the same way about that there's a lot of underutilized residue around. This may not be feedlot focused. It's primarily going to be work by Jim and others, more on cows and growing cattle, etc. So there's a lot of ways to use residue, but I'm going to focus on it some too from a feedlot perspective, because you can graze those stalks. Obviously it doesn't fit the feedlot. That's the best way to use them, by the way. You can bale them and use them as a raw feed source and feed cows, and it works great. We've been doing some work on baling it and trying to improve it by treating it and doing other things to it. Or you can look at silage. So when you see us doing work on silage, it's not just random trials we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out what is the best way to use what we think is an underutilized resource here in our state. Especially if there's a lot of interest in taking those stalks and making ethanol, you've got to really know what's the value to you to compare to what's the value going that other direction. That's our logic. Anyway, so I've talked about this. In the next few minutes I'll wrap up. But grazing is the best way, as I mentioned. You can harvest it as baled stalks. Works great for cow-calf, especially with a little bit of wet byproducts. Obviously, it's been a very common roughage use in feedlots, which again works great. By the way, it works great for a roughage source only because you're feeding byproducts. If you're not going to feed byproducts in the future, corn stalks are not going to be the best roughage source. A lot of work on that in history. And then we got some work on treating it, which I'll share briefly. And then this corn silage thing. This corn silage thing had a lot of questions about it. And one of the reasons I think it fits is it fits integrated operations, cattle, corn operations, because one of the challenges with silage is what do you do on those acres? And one of the things that's great is to put manure back out. I'm going to skip this because you've got it in your slides, so I'm going to skip ahead to a summary because we've done a fair number of experiments. I want to stop on this one. This is in the 2014 Nebraska Beef Report. You should have a summary of the 2014 Nebraska Beef Report as a handout. Obviously, we can get you a full copy of the beef reports. They're also available online. But this was a commercial trial where we compared feeding 6% corn stalks with wet distillers grains in a diet at 40% to 20% treated corn stalks. And in a few experiments, including this one, we've seen that actually treated stalks don't give you identical performance as your normal roughage level of non-treated stalks, both on a live basis conversion. This is the number we think is most important. That's carcass-based conversion. We've done some work on grind size, but also in the new beef report is some more recent work. One of the things that happened is producers saw this work and they said, well, I want to do this. I want to go from feeding 5% stalks to 20% stalks because I can buy them cheap. But they were only feeding 20% distillers grains in the diet. And we thought, well, does that matter? Does the level of distillers grains in the diet matter with the response to the treated stalks? So that was the reason for this study that Sarah Peterson did. We had a control diet with conversions of 5/8. So that's our goal. That's what our potential for these cattle to do. That's what we're trying to match. So we tested 20% distillers in the diet or 40 with feeding 10, 20, or 30% treated stalks in both cases. And notice that as you go from the control to 10, 20, or 30% treated stalks with only 20% distillers, conversions get worse. You can't just take and replace corn with treated stalks. But when you've got a lot more distillers in there, 40, notice that feeding 10 and 20% treated stalks does get us to our goal. So I guess we did this work to see how important is level of distillers in the diet to this working. Okay, I probably should have just presented this slide because this is a summary of all the work that we've done. So I'm just being open with you. But by the way, I don't think this applies necessarily to today's situation, which I'll come back to. If you look at all the studies we've done, this line here is how, in our studies, the control cattle did. This column, it's actually, for this first one and this one, this is supposed to be treated because I got a mistake there. But the point is this column right here shows you what's the percent difference between the control and the treated. So in this case, the treated stalks actually did 2.2% better than feeding 5% stalks. This study, they did almost 7% worse. The same, although it was 1.6% worse. And then this is that commercial study where it was 5.4% worse. These two studies don't apply very well because it's 1-inch grind and then 20% distillers. So if you just average all the studies we've done, on average, my best guess if you want to feed treated stalks is that you'll see conversions get about 2.3% worse. If you just feed 20% stalks, it's going to be 11 to 20% worse. Right? So you can't just feed more stalks. But if you want to treat them, it'll be just a touch worse. Is that economical? Well, I think it depends entirely on what's the price of corn, because this requires expensive grain, my last bullet point. What's your price of corn stalks, and what's your price of distillers grains? Because it requires a lot of distillers and relatively inexpensive stalks and relatively speaking expensive grain. We're not in that scenario today. So my recommendation today is it's not as economical to treat or worry about this whole issue. Who knows what next year is going to be like, right? Or the year after. You understand? So it's not a joking matter, but you gotta look at certain years. How is this? What I think we need to think about the crop year that we have, because that's going to dictate what's the best feedlot diets, and it might change every single crop year. That's the challenge I think you have. With that, I would be happy to take any questions. Some of the one file I mentioned is available on our beef website, which you've all seen.